You can recover from illness, but you need to heal from trauma.
Today's guest is Heidi Everett.
I started Schizy Inc. when I was in just come out of a psychiatric unit. When I tell my story to a psychiatrist or a psychologist, I get medicated. But when I tell it in the arts, I get celebrated. The way plants operate is that they reach for the sun and they bring in the energy and they bring it down, and it's this whole system. And for me, that's what healing is like, is that it's an ongoing cycle. That's where things change, when you start looking at mental health through the social model of disability and saying, it's not your fault that someone inflicted their pain on you and you've got an injury.
That's what I was saying, alternatives that we could provide and how people, can get better at it.
Just solve mental illness, get better, ... at it.
Hi everyone, this is a Peer for Peer podcast. My name is Robert Nobilia. These podcasts are dedicated to conversation and storytelling about peer work and the people with lived experience in the mental health industry. Today's guest is Heidi Everett, founder and director of Schizy Inc. One of her quotes is as follows: "It's not enough that we have to go through a mental illness. We also have to survive the psychiatric system. Those of us who already know mental illness and recovery have a responsibility to make the road clear for those yet to come along." Welcome to the show, Heidi.
Hey.
Heidi, you are a singer-songwriter, stand-up comedian, filmmaker, amongst so many other talents and things that you do. But one of the most interesting things for me was, I love this, you're a mental health advocate with living experience pride. Can you explain a little bit about that?
There's a lot wrapped up in there, Rob. Mm-hmm. First of all, thanks for having me on the show. And I am dialed in from Wurundjeri country, which is down Victoria, Melbourne, now. So living experience pride, what is that? Because once you walk into a mental health clinic, that pride feeling sort of does fall out of your boots. So I'm pretty busy down here in Melbourne in the arts community, and specifically in the disability arts community, and that includes the deaf arts world as well. And they've got this wonderful global movement, the Pride movement and disability pride. And I thought, well, if you consider that mental illness, as it's known, is a disability, then it also encompasses that we should be part of the pride movement as well, the disability pride movement. So,
and that's fantastic. When I heard about that concept, I just went, yes, that sounds so right. It's being proud of exactly who you are, and you've developed this whole Schizy Inc. Tell us a bit about that organisation.
Well, I can always tell who said the word schizophrenia before when they say Schizy Inc. We had a lovely young politician once get up and introduce the Schizy Inc. And we've had all sorts of incarnations of the term Schizy Inc. But it's basically an arts organisation for people who identify with schizophrenia. And that includes schizoaffective, but it also includes everyone else in the mental health networks, because we kind of think that complex trauma is behind a lot of schizophrenia diagnosis. So when you think about complex trauma, then you start to include depression, all the, things like BPD and OCD and PTSD. And it's anyone who has survived life, basically. So if you're a survivor and you've survived something, you're welcome at Schizy Inc. But I think around probably 70% of the members and the artists have schizophrenia.
70%. So there are all sorts of activities that you run within that organisation. Tell us a bit about the different types.
It's Schizy Inc's primarily an arts organisation, so we're not a mental health organisation. So we do all arts activities. So when we started out, we did lots of music, and we did music events, and we did a World Schizophrenia Day music event where I got musicians around the world to send me a clip of them playing a verse of Bob Marley's One Love song. And this is before the days of Zoom. So I was sitting on the computer splicing together all these clips to make a music video of One Love by all these musicians from around the world. And then I put it on the big screen in Melbourne, and we had 50 musicians on stage, including the Melbourne Mass Gospel Choir, all jamming along to this one song. So that's where we've come from, that heart of music and live performance. But then I kind of thought, well, if we can do music, there must be other artists out there who do comedy and filmmaking and writing and visual arts who also need to feel part of this community. So then we kind of started to focus more on filmmaking and performing arts. So now we do a lot of performing arts. And we've got an art studio that we've just opened, and it's completely lived experience led, all of this. So we employ professional artists, but all the people who run the show have lived experience of diverse mental health.
Fantastic. And like from that mental health perspective, what you're saying is it's important to encourage creativity and expression. Is that the main thing there?
I don't know if you relate to this, but when you've got a mental health reality, your voice is your healing. So people, and I've been this as well, really shut down where I can't speak and I can't look up, and like I'm looking down all the time. And when you start to tap into your voice and you start to express what's going on internally, then you have a much better sense of control over what's going on in the internal and external world, if you can kind of translate it a bit. So that's why I love the creative arts, because it gives us a voice in non-traditional, non-Western ways. So, you can kind of sing your story, or you can draw it, or you can act it out in your body, you can paint it. So you don't necessarily need to speak, but you can definitely express.
It feels so good once someone, well, definitely I know within myself, to get to that point where you can, have the courage and the know-how in order to get to that point of really, truly expressing your voice or yourself. It is a difficult-ish journey to get there.
Yeah, and especially if it's coming from someone else's pain that you're carrying in your body. If you're carrying someone else's pain, it's really hard to want to go there and give that a voice, because then that kind of reincarnates that trauma. So it's almost like you've got to kind of do your apprenticeship in the mental health system when you're a young person. You've got to do 10 years of therapy and psych appointments and all this other stuff before you can start to experiment with that journey. So I just feel that when I tell my story to a psychiatrist or a psychologist, I get medicated. But when I tell it in the arts, I get celebrated. And it's a completely different relationship with my story when you tell it in the arts, or, in a peer community. It's a different hierarchy and a different relationship.
Another question I'd like to ask, Heidi, is so what, it's to do with what inspired you to create Schizy Inc. And I would say that, of course, what would be part of that, correct me if I'm wrong, is, your passion for inclusion of diversity, right? And so my question is, how can people in general improve on being more inclusive of diversity?
Another big pow question. So you might need to remind me of the second one, but I got involved with I started Schizy Inc. when I was in just come out of a psychiatric unit, and Schizophrenia Week, and the little bus tootled us around town, dropped us off at some Schizophrenia Week activities, and it was lovely. A local council had put together little activities around the community for the community to go and do during the day, and this little bus went boop, 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 around we went. And one thing we did card making, and then paint pouring, and then a little bit of songwriting, and there's this lovely little tapas of art. And I thought, why can't we do this every day of the year in the community for people, for anybody, who experiences mental health realities? So, and I was really big into music in those days. So I was just beginning my music career. And so I thought, I'm going to start a Schizophrenia Week event like the one I was talking about, and pull in all the different musicians around my local community. And my local government got involved, and the local rehab got involved, and they supported me to practice, my burgeoning, I just wanted to make events. It's always been in my blood to run little events and things. And so we did this multi-music event in the local art centre, and it was a sellout. Like, there were like 500 people that came, and we had to open up the doors and get people sitting in the foyer, and it was over the top, and it was amazing. And that kind of just went, right, this is what I'm going to do. And I started Schizy Inc with that One Love music jam, and then I thought we need to keep doing this for the rest of the year as well. And then I got into advocacy, and whoa, you got to be careful in advocacy. You got to be really careful.
Explain to us in what way you need to be careful.
Yeah, so you got to go into it with your like your eyes open, because it's very academic. Mental health advocacy at the moment, and always has been. So it's very political and very academic, and people advocate for better psych wards and better mental health systems. And you can't just walk into those spaces and start, spruiking your wares. You've got to earn your spot in those spaces by going through university and working for mental health services and being part of the network. And you got to work your way up before you can get that respect and that credit. So I tried that for many years, and I just kept getting wounded by it. And then I thought, stuff it. I'm just going to invest in the arts. That's my world. That's my soul. That's my spirit. I'm an artist. So, and then I thought, I'm going to bring in the advocacy through the arts. So now what I do is I advocate for mental health access in art spaces and cultural spaces. So it's kind of like, I've just done a gig with Australian Centre for Moving Image in Melbourne, and they want to know how they can make an exhibition accessible for people with complex trauma and neurodiverse realities. So, it's about knowing how bright the lights are and where's the quiet room, and is this section of the gallery going to be traumatizing for people with First Nation stories? So it's kind of thinking about how the environment can trigger people's pain, rather than how an environment can manage people's pain. So, if you go into a space and there's bright lights, and you've got depression, like really terminal depression, or you've got complex trauma that's active, and you've got these bright lights stimulating your nervous system, guess what? It's going to trigger a meltdown. So then that's not the person's fault that the bright light is disabling them. And then the venue also has to know, right, if we've got bright lights and we have to have bright lights, we need a sign on the wall saying quiet room this way.
Yeah.
And then we're going to have a quiet room ready. So that's what I do about inclusion now. And it's also about teaching arts organisations to embrace neurodiverse people. And I kind of put people with mental health realities in that neurodivergent bracket, because we do see the world differently and we do move through the world differently. And it's about processing information as well, and it's different to someone who hasn't experienced complex trauma. So it's about teaching organizations that people can also be leaders and employees and tech staff and audiences as well. Disabled people aren't just visitors. We're also people on the stage, and people working the lights, and people working the cameras, and writing the scripts. And it's about, how do you create an inclusive workplace?
Absolutely. There's a lot in what you just said there. I take from that the importance of self-care, being able to operate for anyone in these sort of areas. Also heard the importance of how trauma affects people's lives. And my question sort of follows on to this sort of thing that we might have been speaking about at one stage, and that's the influence of TV advertising and culture. I'm just wondering, what you can tell us about the influence media has on people with disabilities and people with no disabilities, in inverted commas. And if we were to change the message, what would it be in this sort of in that TV culture?
Wow. Well, let's just get a can and open up. Watch all the little worms crawling out there, Rob.
Exactly.
Yeah, so it's a paradox that the most disadvantaged people in community watch free-to-air TV, and the free-to-air TV is actually targeted and made towards the elite. And when I say elite, I mean abled, cis, pretty boring beige people. It's a little group, and that's what free-to-air TV is geared towards. If you look at all these dating shows, they're all, all the game shows, they're all able-bodied, pretty straight people. There's no one with buck teeth amongst them. So it's unfortunately that the biggest demographic of society gets fed media for the smallest demographic of society.
Right.
And we get just blasted with gambling ads and ads for $1 million houses and electronic cars and things, and it's like, it just makes you feel insufficient. That if you're living on $400 a week,
that's a pretty heavy way to feel. Like, and especially if you're talking about a mass effect, and you're saying that obviously people who watch television are generally feeling insufficient. That can cause some serious issues in society everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking before about watching film and how it's that mirror to us. And in the old days, until at least 50 years ago, we all used to stare at the fire for entertainment. So it's kind of like now instead of staring at the fire, we're staring at stuff that we don't need. And I just feel that agony about all these gambling ads and alcohol ads and dating ads, ads for dating shows and things. And I think TV media companies, they are so clever, and they've worked out that what makes us feel inadequate. And I think, they know what the hole is, and they know what the plug is.
Sure, in order for them to be more profitable, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's we all know now that addiction is based probably in childhood trauma of some sort, on ongoing complex trauma. Whether that's neglect or all out abuse, we don't know, but addiction is filling a hole that never got filled when we were kids. And, all these profiteering companies, they just keep pouring in the liquid and then offering the plug.
Yeah.
And it's a sick system. And I think we can't change it because society has always been this perverse. Society is a perverse place, and we can't fix it from where we are. But what we can do is offer that, we can offer that campfire for people to turn away and look into the fire.
And it seems like that's exactly what you're doing. And, I just want to say thank you for that, because I personally, I feel it's a very important job. It's like a safe haven for people to go to, especially for, people who really feel that there's some sort of artistic expression that they could achieve, and you're making it very possible for people. So thank you very much for that. And so, that as we were talking about that encouragement, of expression and creativity, how powerful really is that? Are you saying that that's powerful enough to solely overcome heavy trauma? Or are you saying that it's a supplement to the medical model, let's say, in inverted commas? Tell us about the medical model in your opinion.
Well, I think the medical model has a system, much like the media model. It knows what works, it knows what the hole is, and it tries to keep filling it and plugging it up. And one thing I kind of say is that you can recover from illness, but you need to heal from trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And I think healing is a lifelong process. It's not a fixed process. So healing is a little bit like the way plants operate, is that they reach for the sun and they bring in the energy and they bring it down, and it's this whole system. And for me, that's what healing is like, is that it's an ongoing cycle, and each cycle just grows you up a bit more and a bit bigger and a bit older. So it's a completely different way of looking at things and looking at stories when you think of it in that healing model. And it's a different model, language as well.
That healing model, for me, just there, what you just described, personally, I think it's important for every person to be in that moment, as you explained, and it's a constant healing, because it's sort of can be pretty tough living on this planet. There's a lot of pressure on our bodies and minds, and as you say, if it's an ongoing process and we're constantly aware of that constant process of healing and looking towards positivity, I would say, is that what you say, looking towards positivity?
Well, there's this one word that I love, which is optimism.
Right.
And it seems to be this global consciousness word. I've got to tell you, I've seen a couple of other people talking about optimism lately, and it's like, whoa, what's that come from? But optimism to me feels like a tangible verb that you can pull out in small amounts and practice. Whereas hope and positivity, it's either all or nothing.
Right.
It's quite big, whereas optimism, you can just, play a little bit here and play a little bit there and drag it back here. It's got a sliding scale a bit. So I like the term optimism.
What about, the alternatives that we could provide, and how people, can get better at it?
Oh, I like that. Get better at it.
Yeah.
I love that. Rob, I think you should patent that. Trademark. Get better, ... at it.
At it. Are you going to use that in one of your stand-up comedy routines?
Well, they say you can steal, beg and borrow in comedy, but I'm not that kind of person. So I'll let you take that one, Rob.
Oh, thank you so much. It's gold. It's absolute gold, that one. Heidi, could you please tell us about your experience in the psych ward and how you have navigated around terms like diagnosis, for people and things like that?
Well, I mentioned the apprenticeship before in mental health, and I feel like when you first get thrown into a psych, I shouldn't use that language at all. When you first get escorted into a psych ward, it's all very alien, and it is like you've stepped into a film set that you've never watched before. And it's like, whoa, what's behind that door? And you got all these characters popping out, and you got different, oh man, it is just full on sensory onslaught. It's just coming at you from all angles. And I think public psychiatric wards have a duty to not traumatize people. And that's not, that's a common mantra, is that at the moment psychiatric wards are not the best place to induce healing. They keep you alive, and I absolutely am testament to that psychiatric wards do keep you alive. And then it's kind of like, well, what happens next when you walk out that door? What are you going home to? Are you going home at all? What people are around you outside that door? Is it the same people that sent you to the psych ward? So I feel that that's the kind of negative state about psychiatric wards. And I think within saying that, we have to acknowledge the beautiful, amazing, fantastic community of people who live in psych wards, who work in psych wards, who have experienced and survived psychiatric wards, who keep going in and out of them, every other week they're in them. And I think once you start looking at the humanity of psych wards, things change. You can't help but feel part of something. And, if you've come from a space where you don't feel you belong anywhere, perhaps when you're in a psychiatric ward is maybe the first time you felt you belong to a community. And you start to meet some really beautiful people. And I think what society doesn't understand is that people in psychiatric wards, they're not criminals. I think we get kind of, I don't know, assumed that we're dangerous or something, but it's absolutely the opposite, that people in psychiatric wards are the most wounded, vulnerable people you can find on this planet.
Sensitive, that's the word, and caring and empathetic. And the only time I felt scared of anyone in a psych ward is when someone comes in high on ice. And I think they need to stop that happening. But for 99% of the time, and I've been in and out of public psych wards, some people come across with a front, a bit tough, but they have to, because they have to survive on the streets, or they've survived some pretty gnarly stuff. So, but I just, when I see humanity in a psych ward, I feel absolutely blessed and privileged. You can safely say that some people actually do need psych wards at some point in their life.
Yeah, well, if the latest statistics, if you Google it, fact check, but I think it's around 70% of Australians have experienced some form of trauma. And once you get that in your head, it's like, oh my gosh, what is that? Like 3 in 4 people are walking around who have suffered trauma. And, if you factor in natural disasters, war, grief is a trauma. Like if you've lost your partner, that's a trauma. First Nations, deaf people have got incredible amounts of trauma in their body because the way they're treated, because they're deaf, and they've had to, navigate through a hearing world, a hearing universe. And the amount of trauma that deaf people walk around with is incredible. So 75% is understandable when you start factoring in how abusive society really is.
Would you say that awareness about these conditions, because I'm sure that there are so many people that are just absolutely not aware of what happens, and would you say awareness, through education could be, the way to go in terms of like maybe creating like an infrastructure of an attitude or a series of steps to take in order to accommodate people that go through these things?
Yeah, I think one thing that always surprises me is when a relative of a child says, "Oh, I never saw that coming." I didn't see the warning signs. I never saw it coming. And it's like, well, why have adults never experienced enlightenment around mental health realities? And I don't say mental illness anymore because, when you put in the social model of disability, and I'd love everyone watching this to go out and Google social model of disability and then put it in a mental health context, you really appreciate that it's not your fault that you have a mental illness. It's not your fault. So we can't call it a mental illness because that implies that it's your fault to have an illness. That phrase in the political world about burden of disease and mental health, mental illness is a burden of disease. Well, it should actually be an onus of responsibility rather than a burden of disease. And I think that's where things change, when you start looking at mental health through the social model of disability and saying, it's not your fault that someone inflicted their pain on you and you've got an injury. You can't walk around blaming yourself for a mental illness anymore. Just stop it. Just stop it now.
Stop it now.
Stop it. Cut it out. And start thinking about, right, what's the onus on my environment? What blame can I actually take from me and put over there? I also want to put a caveat on that and say that you can't disassociate from the responsibility about healing. Like, you have to be a full-on player in that. You can't blame somebody else for taking responsibility for your well-being. That's up to you.
What you're talking about, Heidi, is a dream of mine, where people are, highly cooperative, highly understanding and compassionate, and realize that it's a one, like we go back to the Bob Marley song, one love, one people, one thing, one heart. And I pray that through people like you, we can get more people on that train.
Thank you, Rob. And that one love, I can guarantee, is happening in every psychiatric ward in every country, every state in this country, because that one love, once you start getting into the nitty-gritty of people, it's there.
Heidi, could I ask you, what is your understanding of peer work? What is meant by peer work in your words?
I Googled the term peer. Like I Googled what the definition of peer is. And it's one of these words, there's a few words in the English language that have an absolute double meaning. So they mean the opposite of each other. And peer, the first meaning is someone in nobility, someone high ranking, someone with, insignia and titles and whatnot, a peer. And then conversely, it's someone on the common level, like it's someone, your peer in a workplace or your peer in a sports field or something like that. So it's a common denominator. And I thought, what a fantastic term for what you do, for peer. And what some of us do in the arts and things is that it's got that duality that we're actually doing things that the government could and should be doing, but they're not. And we're also, boots on, out there scrubbing it around with the rest of our friends. So, it's like it's got a fantastic magical connotation, and I congratulate anyone who attached the word peer to what we're doing, because it kind of sums it up for me. And I think we have to be able to put on the robes and talk with the funders and the politicians and the advocates and the academics and, the big boards. And we have to be able to do that in our work. But then we also have to stay absolutely true and authentic with who we are as people and our community as well. So
I agree. Thank you so much. What a great job you're doing. I really love Schizy Inc. and it's so exciting. And I hope you can start a new wave, a trend, around the country, a national thing.
Well, I'd love to. And, Mark and Rob, if you want to do something across the airwaves this next year for Schizy Week, film or music or something, I'm up for it. Let's do it.
Great.
Yeah.
We can do that.
And I'd love to come visit one day. Thank you.
Thanks very much for joining us. See you next time on the Peer for Peer podcast.